Tomorrow, I will write what will be for me 2 largish checks. One will be to the Internal Revenue Service, because I, like many of you who I have spoken to in the last couple weeks, have kind of had the surprise of having what I owe this year to be a little larger than what I expected it to be this particular Ides of April. My check will join others as we become what I believe ourselves victims of a very quiet, hostile takeover that has been decades in the making. Or I could also say a waltz into a new way of being. Tomorrow, April 15th, many will complete filing for the first time under the new tax bill, a bill which most analysts agree will deepen an income gap that is already the size of the Grand Canyon. We clearly live in a new Gilded Age, says writer Giri Dharadas, who is now pointing out the way that we in the United States revere wealth. He writes, "This is as inequitable a time as America has been in for 100 years. It is inevitably also as angry a time as it's been in, and it's as democratically dysfunctional a time as we have been in many a generation." Now, as our front of our order of service says, as I've already pointed out, they say that only 2 things are inevitable: death and taxes. And yet many of us writing larger checks this year resent not that money, but that it is underwriting not the people who need it the most, but groups that some are calling the new oligarchs. And they, in fact, will be writing smaller checks this year. Now, if circumstance means that you are writing a smaller check this year, I am not probably talking about you. That would be my guess. I am talking about what Cal professor Robert Reich says is now, we refer to often as the 1%, but he says it's really the 10th of the 1% now in our nation who control the vast majority of the resources among us. We know that business and entrepreneurship do and create good, and this is not about that. It is not about the values of a free economy, but what we are talking about is a way in which those values are increasingly becoming our religious values in a very particular religion in this nation as well. These cuts will cause further and deeper cuts to the programs which aid those who are lacking basic services the most, and it will slash, it is predicted, funding for the nonprofit sector and drive another dagger into the heart of our collective moral imagination. Now, I will admit that it is kind of an unusual thing for me to be able to preach this particular sermon because it allows me to use my policy wonk part and also my ministerial part, and I'm very excited about that. So just in case you think that I'm also using my hyperbolic writer part, I want to say again, yes, a dagger into the heart of our collective moral imagination. And here's why. Because this is, in fact, become among us a moral issue. And that is actually the topic of our sermon today, even though we're going to talk about things like taxes and services. Because poll after poll showed that only 1/3 of the voters supported this 2017 overhaul, and yet it still happened. Why was this? Well, one reason was we have a lot of daily distractions that kind of keep us from focusing on anything that's happening before us. But it may also have happened because we've allowed an insidious shift in the values of our nation to dance into our midst. As religion has declined in our nation and in all the other nations we used to give the pompous name of first world countries, we have lost a sense of a larger calling and replaced it with the worship of the market and a new mythology which has made hyper-capitalism a new god among us. And it's this, rather than the writing of particular checks of particular amounts, that should cause us the most concern. This new tax plan, which takes from the middle class of certain states to give to the internationally wealthy, will aggravate rather than address the fact that we have more and more impoverished among us. Somehow, in our obsession with devices and products, we are no longer even really moved that much by the fact that we hear over and over and over again that the poorest among us are also the youngest among us. The poorest among us as a group, as the Children's Defense Fund points out endlessly, are in fact our children. The poorest age group in the United States of America, one of the richest countries of the world. 1 in 5 children live in poverty. And on the other side, also not somehow getting our regard and caring, is that 1/3 of our most senior households have no money left over every month, and that 61% of those households have some form of debt with a median total of around $40,000. Why is this happening? And why is this an action that requires our spiritual practice? Because in some, I would argue, we are in a troublesome tango with new values that we may not even know are our dance partners. I want to share with you some thoughts from a provocative talk to the Aspen Institute that Adon Giridharadas gave in 2016. And he called it, just because they asked him as he was going up to the mic, what are you going to call this? He literally called it this: the thriving world, the wilting world, and you. It's pretty good for in the moment, huh? But these are a couple facts that he shared. The winners who have benefited the most in the last few decades have benefited from a massive reconcentration of wealth in the upper echelons of the society globally. They are huge beneficiaries of generation-long efforts by the corporate world to shift risk from the people at the top and from the corporations themselves by transferring them often onto the workers, and often the most vulnerable part of the workforce. And finally, he says, the winners of our age have benefited hugely from their institutions' growing remoteness from any community. They're increasingly globalized and virtual, which has meant them insulated from the effect they're having on others' lives with devastating consequences. He says, in the old days, if a company's CEO suddenly dumped the defined benefits pension, you knew who to go to see to complain. Today, it might be an unseen private equity fund that lobbies for the change. And there's no one to talk to about that. In short, Giridharadas says, his work let him see, quote, how my country was slowly dividing into two parallel societies, a republic of dreams on one hand, and a republic of fears on the other. What is more insidious about the supersized corporate greed, Giridharadas says, is the fact that we have allowed its values to become our values. It's not about whether this is the most efficient system. We can debate that at another time in which to organize our economic activity. What we know is it is not the system that we need to organize our moral decisions. Values which privilege the individual will, which scoff at the foolishness and naivete of collective enterprise, and which make superheroes of the uber-wealthy, do not stand us in good stead for the long term. In our mythology, Giridharadas says, they didn't just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they invented boots. You can laugh, that's okay. In this moment in time, there is a chasm between the core of the American self-image and who we are. This is a story less true now in America than any other rich country, that you can, in fact, pull yourself out, or that you're going to suddenly benefit from some get-rich-quick scheme. I need to say that yesterday I flew back from Spokane, Washington at 5 in the morning, and in the seats all around me were people who did not look like they had particularly a lot of money. For the 2-hour flight, 3 of the people around me undid lottery tickets for the entire flight. They sat there the whole flight, unrelated people, just scratching lottery tickets for more than 2 hours. We have been drawn into a value system which says that to be poor is to be morally wrong. And sociologist Arlie Hochschild says, what if your dad's job and how much he earned was the central fact of your life? What if it was a blue-collar job, but you felt put down for him doing that blue-collar job? I think there's something, she says, actually missing in the entire vocabulary we have about talking about social class, because there's a lot of sneering on the left at the blue-collar class, sneering all over the place. These sorts of ideas are why we have to look at our own spiritual practices of staying engaged and investing in the places that actually bring us into the values that we hold. Spiritual entrepreneur Krista Tippett calls it a lack of moral imagination. That's what she says the spiritual malaise is gripping our nation today. Into this void has been all these get-rich-quick schemes. But Giri Daradas says, in America, your parents' income today has the greatest predictive indicator of your income. And that's a hard thing to hear, but it's also something that could boost us, he says, into creativity. With these values, we have become convinced that the best thing we can do is give more to the oligarchs who will help us find what we need. And that is the myth that we are living in today. Except that as income inequality grows, we see that this is not true. Our larger tax checks this year will not fund refurbishments on the public square. They will subsidize the agenda of those who already control the public square. A lot of how you get decent people upholding an indecent system is culture, Giri Daradas says. It's vocabulary, it's values. And a lot of how we got there, in my view, is through seemingly innocuous language that found ways to smooth over real problems so that we didn't address them, so that they festered and festered and festered. It's language like win-win, he says, which sounds great, but in some deep way is actually about the people with the most resources saying that the only acceptable forms of social change are the forms of change that kick something back upstairs. Language like doing well by doing good. The only conditions under which I'm willing to do good is that under which I would also do well, he says. He says we have accepted an ethic that the winners of our age must be told to do more good, but never tell them to do less harm. That is the contract, he says, we are working under, that we can tell people to do more good, but never tell them to do less harm. In his new book, Winners Take All, Giri Daradas concludes that in our nation, we have become so enamored with the cult of the market that the moral challenge among us is simply to find any time or space in our weeks to return to other values and to enforce them and figure out how we are living them in our life. He says, this is not an indictment of people in business. A significant number, many of us don't work in business, but in any sector, we're living in an age in which the assumptions and values of business are more influential than they ought to be. Our culture has turned business people into philosophers, revolutionaries, social activists, and saviors of the poor. They may be taking people's homes and neighborhoods on one hand, but we laud them for giving coding lessons to a few teens on the other side, he says. We are at risk of forgetting other languages of human progress, of morality, of democracy, of solidarity, of decency, and of justice. He points out that business people in the 1950s would always have, in addition to their business person's hat, a second hat. That hat, he said, might just be like strong community member or t-ball coach or volunteer for the Rotary Club. But that second hat was often a spiritual or religious hat. They were in church. They were with other people that cared about a different set of values that they also brought into their day-to-day. They went to see those other people almost every week. They had that parallel set of values that was some way reinforced or in tension with the first hat, and they lived in that tension and made decisions out of that tension. Within this new system, we need to recognize that we have not only decided as a nation not to fund our governmental operations, we have also dealt a huge blow to the charitable world. Those who estimate such things estimate that we will lose this year $13 billion in lost charitable contributions and more than 200,000 nonprofit jobs because of the loss of the charitable deduction for many. But this is an interesting thing to realize, that the deduction itself, that doing good where you also get something good, has become the main motivation for many people in giving to charitable causes. And that talks about the way that these videos have danced their way, these values have danced their way into our lives. This is the cost of replacing our moral imagination with a travel fund or an Amazon password, our commitment to creating community with a commitment to screen time. Not only will tomorrow's tax day mark a continued loss of our public sector to repair the cavernous divide between us, it will also mark our increasingly neglect of the nonprofit and charitable enterprises among us. These are the places where often we have our social entrepreneurship, where we imagine ourselves into a more equitable and inclusive world, and where we repair and nourish our spirits weary from the day-to-day fray of our lives. Just here in our small world at MDU-UC, I know that we have many who are struggling now with tax bills they didn't expect. And I know we have others that are feeling like they came out better than they thought they would. But I also know here that we provide assistance and comfort, meaning and connection and solace to those who have health clubs and dining clubs and travel clubs, and to those who do not. We provide food assistance to a growing number of people, and we work for a world in which everyone could have a home, a basic thing, a home that's not taken away from them. We use our combined muscle to speak other values out into the public square and into the public discourse, and that is important to do. These are small things, but they represent a chance to build here a countercultural culture, to hold it and maintain it, to keep that spark alive as we move through this new Gilded Age, where your value is increasingly measured by your consumption and your worth increasingly determined by who you can dance with. Now, I said at the beginning of this sermon that I tomorrow will write 2 checks. One will be to the Internal Revenue Service. The other will be the next installment of my pledge here to help keep alive this place of the second hat, the place of the second language, the place of those larger true values of our true heart, that incubator of a new moral imagination for our time, that place that is about something more than just an easy charity, but about creating a place of hope, a place to hold the values that need expression and which we hold dear. I write that check because each year, regardless of other circumstances, I invest 10% of my income here each year, and more in other places that I believe are creating the world about which I dream. My values, I need to say, were not reflected in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, so I must invest elsewhere. You know, in the Gilded Age, the waltz was invented and the tango was brought to these shores. But ragtime also came into being. And it was music invented by a man, Scott Joplin, who aimed to be a classical composer, but who saw his music played more in speakeasies and whorehouses, much to his great dismay. We have ways in times like these of creating beauty out of all the mess that is before us. I still believe personally that we need a strong public sector, one that helps us do those things that we cannot rely on a market which has an interest in profit at its heart. I also believe that we need a strong charitable and nonprofit sector as well. But what I mostly believe is we need places where we can practice, hold, keep, and remember those other values that are so essential to our long-term survival as human beings. Anand Giridharadas puts it this way: this is a story in some ways about 2 rival faiths. It's a faith about what we do alone versus a faith about what we do together. Together, I hope we will continue the practices, day-to-day practices of building together a community, which is sometimes hard, to hold not just people, but the values of a people, that through our support we might create a small oasis where we can cradle and nurture other languages of the human spirit, which we need to keep alive like heritage seeds among us. We need to keep the sacred stories safe, because I know if we do, we will emerge from this particular Gilded Age with a belief in community, in growth and transformation, and in a world in which you have value no matter what you do, no matter what you know, and no matter what you own. Here, may we continue to build a little corner of the world that we believe together, that together we are more, and that the richness of all that is our life matters. That is my wish for this April 14th.